the queen was eliminated by the pharaoh. Egypt's dunes are known for their ability to conceal information. Entire eras of history have been concealed and preserved for more than 3,000 years by the shifting banks of the Nile and the rising dunes of the desert. The pharaoh's erased queen's riddle is one of them. Her name used to adorn temple walls, and her image was engraved in stone next to the representations of heavenly power. However, in the centuries that followed her rule, her statues were either buried or recarved to look like someone else, her portraits were hammered away, and her inscriptions were chipped into nothingness. One likely suspect is presented to us by mainstream Egyptology. During the 18th dynasty of Egypt in 1479 BCE, Queen Hatshepsut was the woman who dared to hold the position of pharaoh. She ruled over a golden age of trade, architecture, and stability, for decades while sporting the artificial beard of a king. However, Thutmose III, her stepson and heir, appears to have ordered the methodical destruction of her memory years after her death. According to official claims, she was erased for political reasons in order to establish a clear male succession line. However, this account is complicated by peculiarities in the record. As though someone in the court disobeyed the order, some of her monuments were completely spared. Only priests can see inscriptions bearing her name tucked away deep into temples. Additionally, the chiseling in one isolated quarry was left undone, as though the erasers had been distracted or had lost their composure. Some historians on the fringes suggest even more bizarre scenarios. They point out that trade excursions to the enigmatic land of Punt, which Egyptologists are still unable to locate on a map, took place during Hatshepsut's rule. These expeditions introduced live, mere trees, frankincense, exotic items, and myrrh. To Egypt, would Hatshepsut have returned with more than just merchandise? Perhaps information or partnerships that endangered Egypt's balance of power? If this is true, deleting her would hide the agreements she made in addition to removing her name. Later Egyptian tradition also has references to her story. The feather sign is frequently used to depict the goddess Mayat, who is the embodiment of truth. However, in a few post-Hut temples, the feather is absent and is substituted with silent symbols. Is it a coincidence? Maybe. However, it is tempting to think about the overlap. Her erasure is even more perplexing because academics continue to argue over whether it was a hate crime, a political necessity, or perhaps a component of a broader religious movement. Ancient Egypt occasionally altered its own history, as we know. Pharaohs erased rivals' memories or recarved monuments to commemorate wins they never achieved. However, the campaign's systematic approach feels different here. Even the smooth, polished, ageless pieces of her face that we have recovered have that subdued rebellion. They serve as a reminder that history encompasses more than just events. It also includes what people wished to be remembered. Furthermore, there was a strong desire for the pharaoh's deleted queen to be completely forgotten. The lost Alexandrian library, a edifice that looked almost legendary in its ambition, once stood in the center of the ancient Mediterranean, where trade ships from Greece, Egypt, Rome, and beyond came into contact. There was more to the great library of Alexandria than just scrolls. More than 2,000 years ago, it served as a storehouse for all of human knowledge. Established under the Tmic dynasty in the 3rd century BCE, its goal was to collect all texts, from all cultures, Chinese maps, Babylonian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Greek philosophy, Egyptian documents, and perhaps reports from places we haven't yet discovered. According to popular history, the library was destroyed by time and battle. The Siege of Alexandria by Julius Caesar in 48 BCE, the subsequent invasion by Emperor Aurelian, and the ultimate transfer of authority to Christian Rome all had an impact. We are informed that each occurrence destroyed or dispersed pieces of the collection, but the first strangeness is right here. When and how the entire library was destroyed are not made explicit in any ancient source. Its demise is a hazy mass of rumors with enough holes in it to support a triumph. The devastation story may have been a cover, according to some historians. After all, it was reported that the Tummies would seize any manuscripts that visitors brought into the city, copy them, and then return the copies, retaining the originals. This program would have accumulated distinctive, potentially contentious works over decades, ones that might question religious orthodoxy, subvert governmental authority, or expose technologies that were decades ahead of their time. Even more extreme fringe theories contend that rather than being lost, some of the library's collections were covertly moved. It was said that the most dangerous scrolls, including astronomical charts that suggested the Earth was much older than the official history permitted, were kept at the Capium, a sister library and auxiliary temple. During the Middle Ages, several Arab academics cited Alexandrian literature that were no longer in circulation. Did they use texts that had been saved? The strange case of the so-called Alexandrian codes, a few texts in private collections from the Renaissance that were ascribed to unidentified Greek-Egyptian scribes, is another example. The fact that they are there indicates that some of the library's treasures had endured. For centuries after the purported final destruction, there are still intriguing clues in the archaeological record. Some people think that the enormous stone vaults beneath contemporary Alexandria, which have been sealed since antiquity, were formerly a part of the old royal area. Because so much of the city is submerged, excavations proceed slowly. Officially, there is no proof of a direct connection to the library. Unofficial rumors of artifacts being covertly removed during underwater surveys continue to circulate. Whether the Great Library was indeed destroyed in a single catastrophic event, or if its disappearance was more planned or gradual, selective eradication of harmful ideas under the pretense of accidental losses still up for debate among academics. The irony is incisive. It's possible that someone obliterated the most brilliant blueprint of the human mind ever put together in an attempt to preserve the safest version of history. Thus, the story of the lost library is still more about shadows and stillness than it is about fire and ash. There is a much more frightening possibility somewhere in between the fiction and the fact. Perhaps some of its secrets were never truly lost, only concealed in locations we haven't yet discovered. Beneath the desert, the forgotten city. Almost anything can be hidden in the desert. The bones of civilizations lay beneath its infinite sands, just waiting to be discovered by the appropriate archaeologist or wind. Historians have been obliged to privately acknowledge that they may have missed a whole period of human history after discovering one such location in recent decades. It is the ancient city of Tanis, a vast urban complex in northern Egypt that was buried by sand and removed from official records for more than a millennium. It is not the biblical city, as some people may remember from mythology. Tanis was unearthed in the 1930s by French archaeologists, according to mainstream excavation reports, and revealed streets, temples, and royal tombs in very good shape. Between 1070 and 720 BCE, the artifacts and stone sculptures displayed the characteristics of Egypt's 21st and 22nd dynasties. Here's the oddity, though. There is no mention of Tanis in the primary historical accounts of the period. There are references to the kings who constructed its magnificent temples elsewhere, but they are noticeably not connected to this enormous city. According to a widely recognized belief, Tanis gained popularity when the Nile changed its path, preventing other cities from engaging in essential trade. Why remove it from the official narrative, though? If that were the case, why are there no celebratory inscriptions announcing its status as the capital of the kingdom? Political rivalry is suggested by certain academics. It's possible that Tanis was ruled by a faction that lost influence, and the winners chose to erase their accomplishments from history. Even crazier discoveries have been reported by fringe scholars. Blocks of stone bearing inscriptions that were obviously from the colossal temples of Peremses, a city that had been abandoned centuries before, were among the items. How did they arrive here? Was the construction of Tanis based on the removal of monuments from previous, possibly more contentious locations? Ramses Car-2 was depicted on one granite lintel, but the carving style indicated it had been modified to fit a different story. The burial items speak for themselves. Gold death masks and jewelry with symbols that don't exactly fit the typical Egyptian pantheon were found in one royal tomb, but they were of a quality comparable to that of previous dynasties. Themes that some associate with the Levant, or even farther afield, or even indications of foreign influence, are present. Could Tanis have served as a magnet for foreigners, a cosmopolitan city whose blending of cultures endangered the Egyptian state's inflexible identity? More questions are raised by the site's preservation. Instead, Tanis appeared to have been shielded from the sandstorms that could have destroyed other communities. When the city was eventually revealed, certain parts appeared to have been abandoned, with tools left on workbenches and pottery in mid-use, as if the residents had departed quickly. What prompted such an abrupt departure? A political purge, an environmental catastrophe, or something more enigmatic? The question of whether Tanis erasure was part of a larger rewriting of history during a turbulent time, or if it was purposefully removed from the record as political retaliation, is still up for contention among academics. However, the outcome is the same. The city was transformed by the sands into a ghost that was forgotten until the present day. Additionally, as excavation goes on, every artifact unearthed from beneath the dunes feels more like a message that will endure beyond the efforts of those who attempted to silence it than a discovery. The Dead Sea Scrolls that were censored. A teenage Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave close to Qumran by the Dead Sea in the winter of 1947 while looking for a lost goat. He heard the shatter of China, not the bleat of an animal. The inadvertent finding would turn out to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. He and his friends discovered clay jars within that contained ancient scrolls and documents written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, some of which date as far back as the 3rd century BCE, the scrolls of the Dead Sea. According to mainstream history, the scrolls contain early manuscripts of the Bible, community regulations, and commentary from a Jewish group that is frequently referred to as the Essenes. Many have been meticulously kept, translated, and examined. However, the scrolls have been shrouded in mystery and dispute ever since they were found. All of the found texts were not made public for decades, which was much longer than anticipated. Meanwhile, they were exclusively available to a select group of scholars. Official justifications point to the difficulty of restoration, the parchments, brittleness, and the laborious translation process. Skeptics, however, point out that these explanations fall short of explaining the exceptional degree of control over document access. Theories started to circulate. Did any of the verses contradict the prevailing religious doctrines too much? Did they include historical narratives that ran counter to the conventional chronologies of Christianity, Judaism, or even the beginnings of Western civilization? The Copper Scroll and the so-called Temple Scroll are two of the most contentious. The Temple Scroll suggests a different religious authority that might challenge conventional wisdom, by depicting a future temple with laws that are much harsher than those seen in the Hebrew Bible. On the other hand, the Copper Scroll resembles a treasure map that lists dozens of secret gold and silver caches that may have been temple treasures hidden during the Roman occupation. Although its assertions have not been conclusively verified or refuted, mainstream scholars frequently reject it as symbolic or overstated. Fragments written around the same time as early Christianity that allude to messianic individuals other than Jesus are much more contentious, by demonstrating that the idea of a savior was not exclusive to any one movement, but rather a recurrent pattern in the area's spiritual environment. These could alter portions of religious history if they are verified and fully comprehended. Access limitations have loosened throughout time, and a large number of scrolls are now digital. However, there are persistent rumors in academic circles that some fragments were covertly taken out of circulation because they were too politically or theologically explosive. The early inventories made when the scrolls were originally brought to Jerusalem do not always correspond with the official catalogues. Whether these exclusions are the consequence of willful censoring or careless mismanagement is still up for dispute among academics. One reality, however, is difficult to deny. The scrolls are not complete, and not just because they've been harmed by time. Pages of the oldest extant documents of humanity appear to have vanished somewhere in the many decades that have passed between discovery and publishing. Thus, we received a treasure and a mystery from the Qumran caves. Some of the solutions may still be hidden away in vaults, cabinets, or private collections far from the desert where they were born. Thus, it may never be entirely answered. China's imperial history is renowned for being well chronicled, including the missing emperor. The 24 histories, which are the official chronicles covering millennia, contain detailed records of its dynasties and emperors. But amid the well-known names and dates, there is a disquieting quiet, a missing emperor whose rule appears to have been purposefully obliterated. This is a figure that was surgically removed from the record rather than lost to time. The Qin dynasty, which unified China under a centralized imperial structure in 221 BCE, is at the heart of the riddle. The founder of the dynasty, Qin Shi Huang, is renowned. The Terracotta Army, the Great Wall, and his infatuation with immortality. However, official chronicles have strange omissions between his rule and the emergence of the Han dynasty. Archaeological evidence points to a brief rule following Qin Shi Huang's passing, perhaps presided over by one of his sons or a senior court official. It is not included in the approved timetable. The reign of Qin Shi, the second son of Qin Sheng, who ruled from 2110 to 207 BCE, is occasionally cited by mainstream historians as the reason for this lapse. Prior to the fall of the dynasty, however, Qin Shi's years in authority are reduced to a warning story in the written chronicles, which portray him as feeble and inept. The issue imperial decrees from an era whose name does not correspond to either Qin Shang or Qin are mentioned in administrative seal and inscription excavations found in isolated provinces. These irregularities point to an undocumented monarch, a person who gave orders throughout the empire but whose name is not included in official records. According to a fringe theory, There was a court coup after Qin Shi Huang's death, in which a rival or regent briefly took control before being deposed and removed from history. Another theory is that the absent emperor symbolized a group that rejected the legalist ideology that actually governed the Qin, maybe supporting measures that the Han dynasty, which had won the war, wished to be forgotten. A strange tomb discovered in Shaanxi province adds to the mystery. There was ceremonial weaponry, lacquered coffins, and jade burial suits in the burial chamber, which was much larger than a normal noble's, but less than a royal mausoleum. The title Son of Heaven remained intact, but the inscriptions had been severely vandalized, with the personal name gouged out. The emperor's mantle was previously claimed by whoever laid here, but their identity was purposefully concealed. The practice of expunging humiliated emperors or officials from the record, known as damnatio memoriale, is not new to Chinese history. Whether this missing emperor was a reformer, a usurper, or just an awkward branch in the Qin family tree is still up for debate among academics. The combination of the text's silence and the physical evidence found in the archaeological record is what makes this case unique. Two stories that don't fit together. The Qin dynasty's fall was anarchy reclaiming the stage, whereas its emergence represented a victory of order over chaos. In that collapse, an emperor ruled for a short time, leaving his stamp on jade, bronze, and clay. Signs that still allude to a period of history that China's early historians did not want us to read, even after centuries of erasure. Stonehenge's builders were silent. The massive stones of Stonehenge rise like a petrified giant's ribs on the Sperry Plain in southern England. They mark the solstices, the year's beginning, and the age-old dance of light and shadow with their thoughtful placement and exact alignments. Historians have argued over who constructed this monument and why for centuries. But behind the arguments is a more subdued mystery. The individuals who originally brought it up have virtually vanished from the annals of history. According to mainstream archaeology, Stonehenge was built over a period of time between approximately 3000 and 500 BC, involving communities with expertise in long-distance trade, engineering, and astronomy. Long before the invention of the wheel in Britain, these people carried blue stones from the Preseli Hills in Wales, which were more than 150 miles away, according to excavations. Just this achievement points to a well-organized, cooperative society with advanced knowledge. However, we have no written records, no surviving oral tradition, and no surviving name for them that explicitly asserts accountability. According to the prevailing story, they were Neolithic farmers who were progressively supplanted by Bronze Age societies. The plot becomes odd at this point, though. Genetic and isotopic research reveal a sharp demographic shift around 2300 BCE. CE, when Stonehenge was at its busiest. Within a few generations, people from continental Europe replaced the original builder, largely erasing their genetic trace from the area. The builders themselves seem to have just disappeared. Some academics suggest that illness or climate change are at blame. Others cite mass graves with people who were fatally injured and signs of violent war that occurred about the same time as Stonehenge's subsequent alterations. However, none of this explains why their tools, burial customs, pottery styles, and cultural fingerprints were so completely replaced, as if the invaders deliberately wiped out the past. Interpretations on the fringe go farther. Because of the stone's exact astronomical alignments and the fact that they were sourced from far-off quarries, some have theorized that the builders had information that was too sophisticated for their time and might have unnerved later generations. Could the lack of information in the archaeological record be the consequence of a conscious effort to break continuity, so that future generations would not be able to completely comprehend whatever function Stonehenge may have had? Nearby locations, such as Durrington Walls, provide enticing hints. Banquet remains indicate gatherings of hundreds or even thousands of people, perhaps synchronized with astronomical phenomena. These were not solitary farmers. They were a component of a network that transported products and ideas over long distances. However, within a century, cultures left little explanation behind and either abandoned or repurposed their monuments. Whether the architects of Stonehenge were exterminated, assimilated into other populations, or willingly scattered is still up for contention among academics. However, their voices are noticeably missing. Their engineering prowess can be quantified in tons of stone. Even while we can follow their trading routes through hills and seas, we are still unable to identify them. Ultimately, the monument they left behind serves as a memorial and a work of art. It informs us of their existence and the decision made by someone somewhere to let us know about their work but not their backstory. The gods of Mesoamerica are vanishing. Stone structures climb toward the sky in tiered tiers throughout ancient Mesoamerica's highlands and jungles. Skeletal lords of the underworld, jaguars adorned with flames, serpents with feathered wings, and violent deities are all depicted on their walls. Millions of people's lives were formerly centered around these gods, who influenced festivals, calendars, and even the destiny of monarchs. However, in many areas, entire pantheons appeared to be deleted from history, as though their own devotees had done so. The evolution of Mesoamerican religious systems over centuries is acknowledged by mainstream archaeology. The pantheons of Zapuch, Maya, and Mexico replaced the Olm gods, each of which included or modified prior deities. Here's the problem, though. Whole deities suddenly vanish in some city-states. There was an abrupt disappearance from sculptures, codices, and temple murals, no slow deterioration or melding into other forms. One notable example is found at the ancient Maya city of Pedras Negras, where early monuments are dominated by images of the maize god. Then his reputation vanishes in a generation. Other symbols, some of which have not yet been interpreted, that point to a swift doctrinal change take his place. However, no inscriptions document the cause. In Maya civilization, which frequently documented religious events and political upheavals in great detail, this is unique. Political motivations are suspected by some academics. Religion and power were linked in Mesoamerica. The legitimacy of competing dynasties may also be weakened if a god is removed from public worship. Others propose environmental cues. A fertility or rain-related god can be dropped in favor of new divine patrons if drought or tragedy hit. However, in a number of instances, like Teotihuacan gods, disappeared during times of stability rather than crises. The more disturbing notion that some deities were associated with knowledge is highlighted by fringe scholars. Later, our ceremonies were judged hazardous. For example, there are fragmentary references to gods who walked among men being buried, or sent away in Aztec tradition. It's uncertain if these are recollections of a cult that was suppressed or metaphors. The situation is complicated by the Spanish conquest. A large portion of the written record was erased as conquistadors and missionaries destroyed countless codices. However, there is evidence of intentional iconoclasm, even in pre-cont archaeology, with altars recarved to honor new gods and temples stripped of their original reliefs. The names of the previous deities were actually scraped out of inscriptions. In certain cases, a stockpile of painted ceramics discovered beneath the Veracruz temple floor is among the most bizarre discoveries. The containers show a goddess with a serpentine visage that is not found in any extant mythology. Although she appears in scenes of battle and agricultural plenty, her name, glyph, is either absent or purposefully hidden on every work. Whether she was a lost goddess whose worship was deliberately destroyed or a regional variation of a known divinity is still up for debate among scholars. It is evident that foreign conquest was not always the cause of these gods' extinction. It was frequently the result of cultural surgery performed by individuals who had worshipped them, depriving their civilizations of the gods they once revered. Thus, Mesoamerican temples tell two tales, one of majesty and devotion, and another of abrupt, silent betrayals that may wipe out even the gods. The Indus Valley collapse in the sandy plains of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India was concealed. The remains of one of the first urban civilizations in history have been discovered. By archaeologists, the Harappan culture, often called the Indus Valley, flourished between 2600 and 900 BCE. Its cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, D'Oliveira, were planning marvels with complex drainage systems, grid-like streets, uniform weights, and a script that hasn't been decoded yet. The story's most perplexing aspect, however, is how it ended and why so little of it is remembered in the past. For a long time, mainstream beliefs claimed that the fall of the civilization was caused by either the entrance of Indo-Aryan migrants around 1500 BCE, changing river patterns that dried out the fertile plains, or climatic change. However, there are indications from the archaeological record that the collapse was neither straightforward nor passive. Skeletons, some with evidence of severe injuries, have been discovered lying in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro. Layers of burning indicate devastating events rather than merely eventual abandonment in Harappa. The most intriguing thing, though, is how the Indus Valley's existence appears to have been virtually disregarded by later societies in the area. Despite their colossal size and temporal proximity, these once great towns receive little to no direct reference in the Vedic writings that are sometimes recognized as important early Indian literature. It seems as though the Harappans were purposefully erased from the cultural memory rather than just forgotten. The demise of the Indus may have been caused by a catastrophic plague or internal rebellion, according to fringe historians. Situations that elites in the past might have wished to conceal. Some argue that the new Indo-Aryan order had a deeper political goal, to eradicate the heritage of an earlier, potentially competing cultural identity. Considering how most ancient civilizations mythologized their forebears, it is odd that the Harappans are almost entirely absent from subsequent myth or folklore. The tablets and seals with the Indus script add to the enigma. No one has been able to read them definitively despite decades of research. They might provide stories of the last years of the civilization and possibly explain why its memory was suppressed if they could be read, in a more subtle type of cultural erasure than burning cities. Some scholars even hypothesize that the language contained on these seals was purposefully left out of later linguistic traditions. The issue of continuity is another. It appears from artifacts like as agricultural implements and ceramic patterns that the Harappans' descendants continued to dwell in rural areas for generations, assimilating into new societies. However, there is no unambiguous oral history that connects these areas to the major cities. Was this amnesia induced, or did it develop naturally over time? Whether the fall of the Indus Valley was a violent conquest, an inevitable natural tragedy, or a politically driven cover-up that buried not just a civilization, but its whole identity, is still up for debate among academics. The untranslatable signs on clay seals, the barren wells, and the quiet alleys of the Harappan world all harbor the ghost of the Harappan world, regardless of the facts. Their story was reduced to a dusty pile of bricks, despite the fact that they constructed cities that were centuries ahead of their time. And maybe that's how someone intended it to be remembered. The Black Nile's forgotten African pharaohs. Nubia, or modern-day Sudan, is located along the southern Nile, well beyond the shadow of the Giza pyramids, an ancient monarchy that controlled Egypt for almost a century before being virtually wiped out from history emerged and fell here. The dominion of the 25th dynasty, sometimes known as the Kushite pharaohs, spanned from the Mediterranean to the center of Africa. Around the 8th century BCE, the city of Napata is where their narrative started. The Nile Valley was united under a single rule when the Kushite kings, Pianki, Shabaka, and Taharqa, marched north and overran a fragmented Egypt. They fought off foreign invaders, restored temples, and resurrected old religious customs. They considered themselves not foreigners but rather restorers of Egypt's splendor in many respects. However, Egyptian scribes and later historians regarded them as little more than a footnote following their final defeat by the Assyrians. Their accomplishments were ascribed to others, their monuments vandalized, and their names were scraped from temple walls. Even contemporary textbooks frequently exclude the Kushite era entirely, moving straight from the New Kingdom to succeeding foreign rulers. Why? It was partly a political issue. Later Egyptian monarchs, particularly those ruled by the Greeks and Romans, favored highlighting Egypt's Mediterranean ties above its African heritage. They did not want to portray a dynasty of black African pharaohs ruling over the country of the gods. The erasure extended beyond Egypt. Western academics minimized Nubia's significance in ancient history for centuries, depicting it as a minor society rather than a strong civilization unto itself. Napata and its later capital, Moro, were thriving. Cities with sophisticated ironwork, colossal pyramids, and a unique written script, according to 20th century excavations. However, even these discoveries took a while to make their way into the mainstream. Art may be the clearest indication of this cover-up. The Kushite pharaohs are shown with characteristically African characteristics, like as large noses and big lips, in temple carvings that have withstood the chisels of erasers. However, these characteristics were gradually modified to conform to more Eurocentric ideals via artistic reproductions in textbooks. The public's perception of these kings gradually deteriorated. Archaeologists in Sudan are currently gradually reconstructing the lost heritage of these kings by discovering gold-filled royal tombs, military victory inscriptions, and proof of extensive commerce networks that extended far into Africa. The public knowledge gap is still very large, though the history of Egypt did not end with the Kushite pharaohs. They served as its protectors, constructors, and kings. And one of the most purposeful cultural omissions of the ancient world may be their near erasure from popular history. They did not simply disappear, they vanished because of someone. The city that disappeared under the ocean, Heracleion. Heracleion was a fantastical place for over a millennium. It was described in ancient Greek sources as a famous Egyptian port city where pharaohs would greet foreign envoys with gifts of gold and where Helen of Troy had sought shelter. However, Nothing was found when medieval explorers arrived looking for it. Not even a hint of its exact location. No beach, no ruins. The city seemed to have vanished completely. Heracleion was not a myth. In fact, at the confluence of Egypt and the Mediterranean, at the mouth of the Nile, was a bustling metropolis. There were massive statues, tall temples, and busy docks where traders from Phoenicia, Greece, and other places traded commodities, news, and ideas. During the late Pharaonic and early Ptolemaic periods, it was one of Egypt's most significant cities, due to its advantageous location. Nevertheless, it disappeared. The delta was rocked by earthquakes sometime in the 2nd century BCE. Parts of the city sank under the water due to rising tides, unstable clay soils, and potentially even a huge flood. Centuries of history, artifacts, and documents were lost, as Heracleion completely submerged under the sea in a matter of decades. Heracleion gradually vanished from maps and eventually from memory as Alexandria emerged as Egypt's principal port. Only sporadic legends were left by the Middle Ages. Some said that because it had offended the temples, the gods had swallowed it. Others thought it was another name for Atlantis. In actuality, the truth was more tragic and nuanced. It wasn't a natural sinking of the metropolis. Political decisions had silently sealed its doom. Rulers and chroniclers alike were not interested in perpetuating the memory of a rival city as Alexandria's prominence increased. Official records began to mention Heracleion less frequently, and soon it was virtually completely removed from Egyptian history. For centuries, academics argued about whether it had ever existed at all. That is, until 2000, when Frank Gaudio, an underwater archaeologist, found its remnants off the north coast of Egypt. Divers discovered enormous statues of gods, enormous temple remains, mud-preserved battleships, and hundreds of inscriptions beneath silty strata, proof of a thriving, cosmopolitan metropolis that has long been forgotten. The amount that had been purposefully omitted from history texts, however, was possibly the most bizarre finding. The neat, straightforward chronology of Egypt's downfall and Rome's ascent was called into question by the inscriptions, which disclosed political agreements, tax documents, and religious customs. There was more to Heracleion than a harbor. It was a hub of riches, influence, and power that was on par with Alexandria. Its memory being so completely wiped out points to more than time's lack of concern. It implies that it was intended to be forgotten somewhere. Heracleion is now preserved in the dark waters of Abukir Bay, a submerged ghost city. We must reconsider our understanding of Egypt's last centuries of freedom in light of its discoveries, and we are left with a single, unsettling thought. What else has been engulfed by the sea and the stillness of history if a whole city of temples, statues, and ships could be lost for 2 millennia? Conclusion: a pattern not of discrete mysteries, but of a tapestry of human memory that has been purposefully unpicked emerges throughout these 10 shadows in the historical record. The gaps reveal just as much as the pieces that remain visible. There are no longer any ancient stones that should be standing. Ash replaces scrolls that ought to be kept. Once powerful names have been reduced to murmurs. These cover-ups might have been control mechanisms, or maybe they were last-ditch efforts to keep information out of the wrong hands. The outcome is the same in either case. Our perception of the past is skewed, fragmented, and even deceptive. But by following the strands and challenging the official narratives, we are subtly assembling a picture that is closer to the reality, one fragment at a time. Additionally, it's possible that the worst lie of all is that history is never really